How to win in Pokemon VGC. It's a very interesting topic which hasn't been covered by many YouTubers as it is quite complex at a higher level. But today, I'll go over everything from mindsets to team building and even how to use the terrestrializing mechanic to its full effect, so to make you a more consistent and knowledgeable player. Now, I just have to clarify, given there is a smidge of luck involved in VGC, it's not entirely possible to win 100% of your games, but what you should be striving for is consistently high placements in tournaments, which doesn't require a 100% win rate anyway. Now, I've categorized VGC players into two different categories. These are proactive players and reactive players. Proactive players are players that think about the future of the game, they think about the consequences of each turn, they think about how each turn will affect the endgame, they are much more patient when it comes to picking up KOs, they try to cover as many options as possible instead of reading into one, they try to win the overall game and not the turn, and they will look for more safer, better options before selecting their moves. Reactive players, on the other hand, play the game off instinct and intuition. They focus on getting the turn they are on right now correct, instead of positioning themselves to do well further into the game. This can lead them into getting swept in the endgame or preserving mons they didn't need to. They will also go for reads if they can justify it, and will usually go for KOs even if it's better to switch and maneuver the board state. Now, not to say being a reactive player is straight up bad. I know many players that play like that have done very well in tournaments. They are just not as consistent as proactive players. Now, one of the major things holding many players back from being super consistent is ego. Ego in Pokemon can make you go for unneeded attacks. For example, if your Incineroar is facing down a Rillaboom and they have an Urshifu on the back, do you Flare Blitz the Rilla or do you Parting Shot it? Many people ego will make them Flare Blitz to take the KO but lose the potential for Fake Out and Intimidate in the endgame, thus worsening their position against the Urshifu. They will also go for less simple moves many of the time to show themselves that they are smart. For example, if someone might protect, they go hard in for the read even though it's fine to hit into the protect, as then the opponent is being passive and not gaining any momentum. They go for reads when they don't need to, and they will also terror for more damage to take an Oko even if you can carry that Pokemon further down the line anyways, and they will almost always go against the obvious option. Now, the best way to cut out your ego is to be more comfortable having turns that don't put either player at a disadvantage, but hold the tension instead. So it may seem like I'm saying you should never go for reads, but this is not the case. There are many scenarios when going for the read is the right play, such as when the turn will decide the winner of the game, or if it doesn't worsen your position by doing so. You can also go for reads if the opponent doesn't see the move as being risky, but if the opponent senses any chance of risk, it's likely they won't go for that move. So if you think that your opponent feels safe, it would be a great time to go for a read to catch them off guard. Now that we've gone over how you should play the game, I want to quickly go over the thought process of each turn. Now, there are 4 things you should be looking for in your turns: your opponent, yourself, the past, and the future. Firstly, you should look at the past. How is my opponent playing? Are they playing aggressively or passively? Have they terrored yet? How many turns of Tailwind are there left, and such? Secondly, you should look at your opponent's possible moves. Which one is most likely to happen? Why do they want this? Ask why they brought the mons they have on the board. What's their purpose? Then ask what's your move? How can I best play around their best moves most safely? Or how can I catch them off guard in that position? Then, lastly, you can go to ask yourself about the endgame. How does this turn affect the next few turns? If I terror now, I can't terror later. How does that affect the future? If I pick up the KO, what can they bring in? If I switch out now, when will I try to use that mon again later? If you follow this structure of how to think through each turn, you'll play much more consistently and find the right plays more and more often. Now, one of the most important things in the game is bringing the right Pokemon into each game. Now, like before, I've categorized leads into 2 sections. There's positional leads and offensive leads. Unlike before, neither is better than the other and should be used in their own accord, but require different play styles for each. Positional leads is when you lead 2 mons that cover for each other's weaknesses and have 2 mons in the back that can switch in for the rest of the Pokemon the opponent has. For example, a lead that covers each other is Incineroar and Fluttermane, as Incineroar can reduce the damage of physical attacks that Fluttermane is weak to, kill ghost types and stop spores and such. And Flutter can take care of Incineroar's fighting weaknesses, coming from mons such as Urshifu. Although both Incin and Flutter are weak to Landorus, this is where you'd have a mon on the back that beats Landorus such as Chempao or Rillaboom as a switch-in. You'll also want your lead to be both offensive and defensive such as Incin and Fluttermane. This will cover the most options possible and allow for a more positional based game. Hyper offense leads include a source of speed control plus an offensive mon with either 1 or 2 more offensive mons in the back or defensive mon. There's also less switch in potential, thus making quicker paced games and less variability in options. It's not bad, but it forces reads and more 50-50s throughout the game against other hyper offense leads. Although it's great to catch an opponent off guard and overwhelm them, and can be used as a mix-up in a BO3 or to take advantage of bad matchups by not letting your opponent slow the pace of the game down. Now I'm going to talk about how to use terrestrializing to its full potential. Terrestrializing is much more than changing your type once per game. It's an option your opponent has to respect throughout the game, and using it well can be the difference between winning and losing. It's a mind game or a constant 50-50 for the opponent that can draw them into making more mistakes and catching them off guard. So the longer you preserve your terror, the more mind games for your opponent occur throughout the game. Also, you want to preserve what mons you have in the back so your opponent can't tell if their terror will hurt them in the future, and then once you force their terror, the opponent's endgame gets screwed over. Forcing terrors occurs when the opponent has no reliable switch-ins into your Pokemon and has to terror to survive the turn. One of the best ways to do this is by having leads that cover all the weaknesses of your opponent's Pokemon, or having speed control forcing the opponent to terror if they don't want to lose the game instantly. By doing this, the opponent loses the mind game, and also you can force the Pokemon to terror into a type that doesn't benefit their endgame. Terrors can also be forced by baits. If your opponent's Pokemon can OHKO you after a terror, or survive a KO after a terror, then they will be inclined to do so. So on that turn that you baited the terror, you can switch into a mon that either takes a hit or is good into that terror, and then they will lose the option for terror in the rest of the game and have a worse off position. Now, the best way to preserve terrors is to have a team and lead in ways that give you as many options as possible. Team building is the other half of playing Pokemon, and it is a must-have to have a good team, or otherwise the amount of wins you can have will be restricted. If your team has a limited amount of options into the top Pokemon and is more linear, it can stop a player from improving and winning consistently. For example, if you have nothing that resists or is immune to water, then Urshifu Rapid Strike can just Surgeon Strikes your whole team safely or force terrors consistently, putting you at a disadvantage. To get around this in team building, here are some things you must have in your team if you want to win more. Defensive tools, such as damage reduction, redirection, intimidate. Positioning tools, which are fake out, protects, and pivot moves such as U-turn, Volt Switch, and Pine Shot. Speed control, like Tailwind, Trick Room, Icy Wind, Electro Web, and Quash. Control tools such as terrain control, weather control, priority protection, taunt, and encore. Disruption, like status moves, knock off, and yawn. Really good type resistances, especially into offensive types, and good type coverage, especially into defensive types. You must also have types that are good into the current format's most common types while having a mix of both offensive and defensive types. Offensive types include things such as Fire, Ice, Ground, Flying, Psychic, Ghost, Fairy, and Fighting. Defensive types are Steel, Poison, Water, Dragon, and Fairy. Neutral types, which are a mix of both offensive and defensive types, are Dark, Normal, Electric, Rock, and Bug. Things to look out for the current format, which is Reg G, is that every team has at least one or two Dark types, which means Fairy and Fighting types will be extremely good in the meta. There are also barely any good Steel or Poison types, meaning Terra Fairy is broken defensively. So that also means that to cover this, you should try and at least have one Steel or Poison move on your team on a mon that is not Steel or Poison, such as how Landorus Incarnate used Sludge Bomb in previous formats to hit the Grass and Fairy types. Also, Ground is hard to come by, but is very powerful offensively, meaning Ground On is also probably good in the meta, which means you should probably try and have a flying immunity on your team. Now I'm going to go over 50-50s. 50-50s is when a turn comes down to two options where it is a 50-50 on what you and the opponent will do, and whoever gets it right will usually win. 50-50s occur when there are limited options, so the best way to avoid 50-50s is to have more options each turn. So how can we give ourselves more options? As previously stated, having a good team can give you many more options. So can leading positionally and not offensively. Preserving your terror for later also gives you more options. And going through the thought process, as I talked about previously, will give you more options as you will be able to see more options throughout the game. Preserving mons also will give you more options. For example, keeping alive a mon can allow you to switch in to get around 50-50s. But sometimes sacking can give you more options also. By sacking a mon, you can allow a mon to come into the game at full HP, which can sometimes allow it to survive a hit it wouldn't be able to otherwise, allowing it not to be a 50-50 for if you protect or not, while still having the option to protect. Also, being more patient when it comes to KOing your opponent's Pokemon can give you more options, as your opponent will have less pressure on you, giving you more flexibility to maneuver around. Now I'm going to talk about endgames. So when thinking about endgames, you want to try and preserve options and limit your opponents. So you want to still have speed control, or maybe preserve your Tailwind or Trick Room setter for later, or only set it up once you know the game won't last longer than 4 turns. Keep your strong mons in the back or healthy, and only attack with them when they can't be KO'd. You also want to preserve Terra while making sure your opponent does not have Terra themselves. You want to carry your opponent's speed control and chip their mons down to a range where your stronger mon can sweep through. Now I'm going to talk about how to win a bad matchup. So playing a bad matchup can be very different from playing a good one. In a bad matchup, you want to draw out the game for as long as possible while positioning your mons in a way that they can do something, or beat the mons that they can beat. So for example, when they have a Calyrex Shadow on the board, you want to have Incineroar or Urshifu Dark. And when they have an Urshifu Water on the board, you want to have a Flutter Mane, which loses to Calyrex but beats Urshifu Water. So you want to use your Incineroar to get rid of the Calyrex before Flutter Mane comes on the field to beat their Urshifu. And you want to try and get your opponent to misplay. By drawing out the game, it is more likely your opponent will misplay as they have more opportunities to, and they will become more drained more and more the game goes on. Also, go for reads when possible. In a bad MU, the only way to win is to play better, so you have to incorporate both good positioning and good reads. Now I'm going to talk about how to have a good chance of winning tournaments. Use teams that are good into 9 out of 10 of the meta teams, as it's impossible to be good into 10 out of 10 of the meta teams, as there's way too much variability in team building. And also make sure it's under the radar, or is a new way to use a meta team, or just a never seen team before in general. People will practice into the meta teams, but people know this, and thus will use off the wall teams to surprise you, so you've never prepped into them before. To get around this, have a team that is good into things generally. So don't try and beat Flutter Mane, but try to be good into fairy types and have mons with good special defense. Also, to win tournaments, you have to be comfortable with the team and the way it plays. Now I'm going to talk about the best ways to practice. So one of the best ways to practice is to look over replays and see what you're doing well in your games and what you're doing wrong, and write it down after. You also want to analyze top players and what plays they make. For example, why did they choose the move over any other option? Look at previous formats' top teams and ask why the mon is good, not what mon is good. This can help teach you what mons might be good in the format used right now. You also want to make up drills for yourself. For example, make a wheel spinner with all the meta teams and you're assigned one randomly. Then use that team and you'll have 45 seconds to figure out how to beat one other meta team. Once time is up, look at what you think was right in the game plan and what was wrong. Also, give challenges for yourself to practice positioning and being down in a game and coming back. For example, you can only deal damage when you can't be KO'd until your opponent loses a mon, or you have to make 4 switches before turn 4. Thank you for listening. I really tried my best to give as much good information to you guys as possible. Make sure to like and subscribe and put a comment down in the comment section about what you want to see from me next. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.